August 15, 1769. A small island in the Mediterranean, Corsica, just 1 year after France annexed it from the Republic of Genoa. In a modest household in the town of Ajaccio, a child enters the world. His name, Napoleon Bonaparte. Nobody could have predicted that this boy, born into minor nobility on a remote island, would one day hold the fate of Europe in his hands. Nobody could have imagined that within 3 decades, his name would be whispered in fear from Madrid to Moscow, from Cairo to Copenhagen. But how does a short-statured Corsican outsider rise from obscurity to become the Emperor of France and the master of continental Europe? How does one man reshape the map of an entire continent, defeat coalition after coalition of the greatest powers on Earth, and create a legend that still captivates us more than 2 centuries later? The answer is far more shocking, far more calculated, and far more brilliant than you might think. This is the story of ambition without limits, of genius meeting opportunity, of a man who turned chaos into conquest. Welcome to Neural Battlefields, and today we're diving deep into the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. Let's rewind to understand the world Napoleon was born into. Corsica wasn't French by culture or by choice. It was an island with its own identity, its own dialect, its own fierce independence. The Corsicans had fought against Genoan rule, and many resented their new French masters. Napoleon's father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer who had initially supported Corsican independence under the revolutionary leader Pasquale Paoli. But when the rebellion failed, Carlo made a pragmatic choice. He aligned himself with the French authorities. This decision changed everything for young Napoleon. Because of his father's new connections with the French government, Napoleon was granted a scholarship to attend military school in mainland France. At the age of 9, he left his island home and entered a world where he was an outsider, a foreign accent, a strange name, smaller than most of his peers. The other students mocked him, called him names, treated him as less than French. But here's where the story gets interesting. Instead of breaking him, this isolation forged him. Napoleon threw himself into his studies with ferocious intensity. Mathematics, history, geography, military strategy. While other boys played, Napoleon devoured books. He consumed the works of great military commanders like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Hannibal. He studied their campaigns, their tactics, their victories and defeats. He wasn't just learning, he was preparing. At the age of 16, Napoleon graduated from the École Militaire in Paris and became a second lieutenant in the artillery. Artillery. Remember that word, because it becomes crucial to his rise. In the 18th century, artillery was considered a technical, scientific branch of the military, requiring mathematical precision and strategic thinking. It wasn't as glamorous as the cavalry, but it was where intelligence mattered more than social status. It was the perfect fit for a young man with a brilliant mind and something to prove. For the next several years, Napoleon served in various garrisons across France. He continued his obsessive study of military theory. He wrote, he read, he observed. And then in 1789, everything changed. The French Revolution erupted. The old order, the monarchy, the aristocracy that had ruled France for centuries, suddenly found itself under attack. King Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette became prisoners in their own palace. The streets of Paris ran red with blood as revolutionary fervor swept the nation. For most young officers from noble families, the revolution was a disaster. Many fled France or were executed. But for Napoleon, the revolution was the greatest opportunity of his life. Why? Because the revolution shattered the old system where birth determined destiny, where titles mattered more than talent. Suddenly, merit could triumph over birthright. Suddenly, a Corsican outsider could rise as high as his abilities would take him. Napoleon initially returned to Corsica during the early years of the revolution, trying to make a political career there. But he backed the wrong side in a local political dispute and was forced to flee with his family to mainland France in 1793. He was 23 years old, unemployed, nearly penniless, with a family depending on him. It looked like his career was over before it had truly begun. But fate has a strange way of intervening. In September 1793, the crucial port city of Toulon in southern France fell to British and Spanish forces, supported by French royalists who wanted to restore the monarchy. The loss of Toulon was a catastrophe for revolutionary France. The government in Paris was desperate to recapture the city. A siege began, but it was going nowhere. The artillery commander was wounded. They needed someone, anyone, who understood artillery and could take charge. Enter Napoleon Bonaparte. Through a political connection, he was appointed as the new artillery commander for the siege. This was his moment. This was the stage where genius could finally reveal itself. Napoleon surveyed the situation with his analytical mind. While others focused on the city walls, Napoleon recognized the real key. There was a fort called Fort Égalité that dominated the harbor. Control that fort and you control the harbor. Control the harbor, and the British and Spanish fleets can't resupply the city. Force them to evacuate, and Toulon falls. It was brilliant in its simplicity. Napoleon positioned his artillery batteries with mathematical precision. He led from the front, risking his own life. On December 17, 1793, French forces captured the fort. Within 2 days, the British and Spanish fleet evacuated. Toulon fell back into French hands. Napoleon had won his first major victory. The impact was immediate. He was promoted to brigadier general at just 24 years old. His name reached Paris. People in power began to notice this young Corsican officer who had succeeded where others had failed. But here's what's truly shocking. Napoleon's rise could have ended just as quickly as it began. In the chaotic politics of the Revolution, fortunes changed overnight. In July 1794, Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of the Reign of Terror and someone who had supported Napoleon, was overthrown and executed. Napoleon was briefly arrested due to his association with Robespierre's faction. He was imprisoned, his career hung by a thread. If the political winds had blown differently, Napoleon might have ended up on the guillotine like thousands of others. But once again, he was released. The charges were dropped. He was back but sidelined, assigned to a desk job planning military operations against Italy. For someone of Napoleon's ambition, this was unacceptable. He even considered leaving France to offer his services to the Ottoman Sultan. Imagine that alternate history. Then came October 5, 1795, another moment where everything changed. The political situation in Paris had become explosive. Royalist factions were planning an uprising against the revolutionary government. The government turned to the military for protection. They needed someone to defend the Tuileries Palace and the National Convention. Paul Barras, an influential political leader who had been impressed by Napoleon at Toulon, gave him the command. What happened next became legendary. Napoleon had limited time and limited troops. The royalist insurgents were numerous and angry. Lesser commanders might have tried to defend the palace conventionally. Not Napoleon. He did something shocking. He sent a young cavalry officer named Joachim Murat to seize cannons from a nearby military depot. Then Napoleon positioned these cannons at key intersections and approaches to the Tuileries. When the royalist mob advanced, Napoleon didn't hesitate. He gave the order to fire. Grape-shot small metal balls that turned cannons into giant shotguns tore into the crowd. Hundreds died in minutes. The uprising was crushed with ruthless efficiency. It was brutal, it was bloody, but it worked. Napoleon had saved the government. The political leadership was now in his debt. His reward. In March 1796, at the age of 26, Napoleon was appointed commander of the French army of Italy. This ragtag force was undersupplied, underpaid, and demoralized. Their mission was to pin down Austrian and Piedmontese forces in northern Italy while the main French armies operated in Germany. Nobody expected much from this sideshow campaign. Napoleon was essentially being sent to a secondary theater with a secondary army. What happened next shocked all of Europe. Napoleon took command of approximately 30,000 poorly equipped soldiers and immediately transformed them. He gave a speech that would become famous. He promised them glory, riches, and victory, but more importantly, he delivered. Within weeks of taking command, Napoleon had achieved something remarkable. He didn't just fight the Austrians and Piedmontese. He separated their armies and defeated them in detail, one at a time. The Battle of Montagnat, the Battle of Millesimo, the Battle of Dago, the Battle of Mondovi, victory after victory in rapid succession. In just 2 weeks, Napoleon forced Piedmont to surrender and make peace. The Austrians were stunned. They retreated. Napoleon pursued. He crossed the Po River, outmaneuvered the Austrian army, and kept winning. The Battle of Lodi on May 10, 1796, saw Napoleon personally lead a charge across a bridge under heavy fire. His soldiers began calling him the Little Corporal as a term of endearment, seeing him as one of them. But here's what made Napoleon truly different from other generals. It wasn't just that he won battles, it was how he thought about war itself. Traditional 18th century warfare was slow and cautious. Armies maneuvered for position. They avoided decisive battles. Supply lines were everything. Napoleon threw out the rulebook. He moved fast, faster than anyone thought possible. He concentrated his forces at decisive points. He forced his enemies to fight on his terms. And most importantly, he didn't just win battles. He annihilated enemy armies. The Italian campaign continued through 1796 and into 1797. Napoleon captured Milan. He defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Austerlitz in November 1796, again showing personal courage by grabbing a flag and leading a charge. At the Battle of Rivoli in January 1797, he destroyed an Austrian army trying to relieve the besieged fortress of Mantua. By April 1797, Napoleon's army was marching on Vienna itself. The Austrians had no choice but to sue for peace. The Treaty of Campo Formio in October 1797 ended the war, but here's the shocking part. Napoleon, just a general, negotiated the treaty himself without waiting for approval from Paris. He was supposed to be following orders from the civilian government. Instead, he was making decisions that affected all of Europe. He was acting like a head of state. The French government back in Paris was alarmed but also dependent on his victories. They couldn't rein him in without undermining the very success that was funding their government and bringing glory to France. Napoleon returned to Paris in December 1797 as a conquering hero. At 28 years old, he was the most famous man in France. Crowds cheered him. Artists painted him. Writers praised him. The young general from Corsica had become a national icon, but Napoleon understood something crucial. Fame is fleeting. Power is what matters. And in the chaotic politics of revolutionary France, today's hero could be tomorrow's victim. So Napoleon did something unexpected. He proposed a campaign to Egypt. Why Egypt? On the surface, it made strategic sense. Egypt was nominally part of the Ottoman Empire but weakly controlled. By seizing Egypt, France could threaten British interests in India and establish French dominance in the Mediterranean. But there was another reason. Egypt would keep Napoleon in the spotlight, keep him winning victories, keep him indispensable to the French government. In May 1798, Napoleon sailed from Toulon with over 30,000 soldiers and nearly 200 ships. He captured Malta along the way. In July, he landed in Egypt and marched toward Cairo. The Egyptian Mamluk warriors, fierce cavalry fighters, rode out to stop him. At the Battle of the Pyramids on July 21, 1798, Napoleon formed his infantry into defensive squares that the Mamluk cavalry couldn't break. The French firepower mowed down the charges. Cairo fell, Egypt was conquered. But then disaster struck. British Admiral Horatio Nelson had been hunting for the French fleet. On August 1, 1798, he found it anchored in Aboukir Bay. The Battle of the Nile was a catastrophe for France. Nelson destroyed nearly the entire French fleet. Napoleon and his army were now stranded in Egypt, cut off from France. Most generals would have despaired. Napoleon adapted. If he couldn't return to France, he would build an empire in the East. He marched into Syria in early 1799, attempting to expand French control. He won several battles but was stopped at the Siege of Acre, where British naval support helped Ottoman defenders hold the city. Plague ravaged Napoleon's army. He was forced to retreat to Egypt. Militarily, the Egyptian campaign was turning into a costly stalemate. But here's where Napoleon's genius for politics matched his genius for war. News from France was alarming. The revolution was in crisis again. The government, called the Directory, was weak and corrupt. France's enemies had formed a new coalition. French armies were losing in Italy and Germany. The country was in chaos. Napoleon saw his opportunity. In August 1799, he made a shocking decision. He abandoned his army in Egypt. He left his soldiers behind and secretly sailed back to France with a few trusted officers. Most leaders would be arrested for desertion, not Napoleon. When he landed in France in October 1799, he was greeted as a savior. The people were tired of instability. They wanted order. They wanted a strong leader. Political conspirators approached Napoleon with a plan for a coup d'etat. They would overthrow the Directory and install a new government. Napoleon would be the military muscle to make it happen. On November 9, 1799, the month of Brumaire in the French revolutionary calendar, the coup began. Napoleon was supposed to simply provide armed support while the politicians handled the details. But when Napoleon addressed the legislature, he was heckled and nearly attacked. The situation was spiraling out of control. His brother Lucien, who was presiding over the assembly, saved the day by calling in troops. Napoleon's soldiers cleared the chamber. The coup succeeded, but barely. A new government called the Consulate was established with 3 consuls at its head. Napoleon Bonaparte was named first consul. In theory, power was shared. In practice, Napoleon was now the ruler of France. He was 30 years old. Within just 3 years, he would make himself consul for life. 3 years after that, he would crown himself emperor. The boy from Corsica had become the master of France. But how did he consolidate power so quickly? How did he go from general to dictator without serious opposition? This is the shocking truth most documentaries gloss over. Napoleon was a political genius. He understood how to manage public opinion. He controlled newspapers and propaganda. He made peace with the Catholic Church through the Concordat of 1801, healing a wound that had divided France since the Revolution. He created a new legal system, the Napoleonic Code, that reformed French law and is still influential today. He established the Bank of France and stabilized the currency. He created the Legion of Honor to reward service to the state. In other words, Napoleon gave France order, stability, and glory. After a decade of revolutionary chaos, most French people were willing to trade liberty for security. Napoleon understood this. He kept the revolutionary promise of careers open to talent while ending the revolutionary violence. He made himself indispensable. But foreign enemies wouldn't accept French dominance. In 1800, while still technically just first consul, Napoleon led another Italian campaign. At the Battle of Marengo in June 1800, he defeated the Austrians again in a close-fought engagement. His subordinate General Desaix's timely arrival turned near defeat into victory, though Desaix died in the battle. Napoleon later rewrote the history of Marengo to emphasize his own genius. He was already crafting his legend. By 1802, France was at peace with all of Europe for the first time in a decade, but it was a temporary peace. Britain and France were natural rivals. War resumed in 1803. Napoleon massed an army on the French coast, threatening to invade Britain. He needed naval supremacy to cross the Channel, but the French and Spanish fleets were defeated by Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar in October 1805. The threat of invasion ended. However, Austria and Russia had joined Britain in a new coalition. Napoleon responded by abandoning the invasion of Britain and wheeling his entire army eastward in one of the most brilliant campaigns in military history. The 1805 campaign saw Napoleon march from the English Channel to the Danube in weeks. At Ulm in October, He surrounded and captured an entire Austrian army without a major battle. Then he occupied Vienna. The decisive moment came on December 2, 1805, at Austerlitz in what is now the Czech Republic. Napoleon faced a combined Austro-Russian army larger than his own. He deliberately weakened his right flank, making it look vulnerable. The Allied commanders took the bait and attacked where Napoleon wanted them to attack. Then Napoleon struck at their weakened center with overwhelming force, splitting their army in two. The Battle of Austerlitz was a masterpiece. The Allies lost nearly 30,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Napoleon lost fewer than 9,000. Austria made peace immediately. Russia retreated. It was Napoleon's greatest victory. But this is where the story takes a darker turn. Napoleon had conquered. Now he had to rule. He reorganized Germany, dissolving the Holy Roman Empire and creating the Confederation of the Rhine under French influence. He placed his brothers on the thrones of various European kingdoms. Joseph became king of Naples, later Spain. Louis became king of Holland. Jerome became king of Westphalia. Napoleon was building a family empire. Prussia, alarmed by French dominance, went to war in 1806. Napoleon crushed the Prussian army in twin battles at Jena and Auerstedt on October 14, 1806. It took him just 2 weeks to destroy a military that had been considered one of Europe's finest. He occupied Berlin. Then he turned against Russia again, fighting brutal battles in Poland during the winter. At Eylau in February 1807, tens of thousands died in a bloody stalemate. But at Friedland in June 1807, Napoleon won decisively. The Treaty of Tilsit in July 1807 marked Napoleon's zenith. He met with Russian Tsar Alexander I on a raft in the middle of a river. The two emperors divided Europe between them. France dominated the West. Russia had a free hand in the East. Britain stood alone. Continental Europe was under Napoleon's control. From a poor boy in Corsica to the master of Europe in less than 40 years. It was unprecedented. It was shocking. It seemed impossible to stop. So what was the secret? How did Napoleon do it? Was it pure military genius? Partly. Napoleon was arguably the greatest military commander since Julius Caesar. His campaigns are still studied in military academies worldwide. Was it political cunning? Absolutely. Napoleon knew how to manipulate, persuade, and consolidate power. Was it timing? Without question. He rose during a revolution that shattered the old order and created opportunities for talent. But here's the real shocking truth. Napoleon succeeded because he understood something fundamental about human nature and power. He understood that people follow strength and confidence. He never showed doubt. He never hesitated. Even his mistakes were transformed into legends through the sheer force of his personality and propaganda. He understood that glory and victory can excuse almost anything. He understood that you can't just defeat enemies. You have to awe them, shock them, make them believe resistance is futile. Most importantly, Napoleon understood that power is not given. It is taken. Every step of his rise involved seizing opportunities that others missed, taking risks that others feared, and pushing boundaries that others accepted. From Toulon to Tuileries, from Italy to Egypt, from Brumaire to Austerlitz, Napoleon made his own destiny. But as we know, the story doesn't end in triumph. Napoleon's empire would eventually collapse. His invasion of Russia in 1812 would be a disaster. He would be defeated by the coalition forces and exiled. He would return for the 100 Days only to be defeated at Waterloo. He would die in exile on St. Helena in 1821, just 51 years old. His empire lasted barely a decade in its full glory. Yet more than 200 years after his death, we still talk about Napoleon. We still study his campaigns. We still debate his legacy. Because Napoleon Bonaparte represents something timeless. The power of individual will. The possibility that one person can change the world. The shocking truth that talent and ambition can overcome birth and circumstance. Napoleon's rise teaches us that history is not inevitable. It is made by individuals who refuse to accept limits, who see opportunities where others see obstacles, who dare to imagine themselves at the pinnacle of power and then climb there, no matter the cost. Whether we view Napoleon as a hero or a tyrant, as a genius or a megalomaniac, we cannot deny the fundamental truth of his story. One man, through brilliance, ambition, and ruthless determination, conquered Europe. That is the shocking truth about Napoleon Bonaparte. That is the rise of an emperor. If you found this journey through history fascinating, then Neural Battlefields has much more in store for you. We dive deep into the battles, the strategies, and the minds that shaped our world. Hit that subscribe button to join our community of history enthusiasts, and don't forget to like this video if Napoleon's story amazed you as much as it amazes us. Share it with anyone who loves tales of ambition and conquest. Until next time, keep exploring the battlefields of history with us.